tabs versus spaces, PHP versus Python, Windows versus macOS versus Linux. These are just a few of the topics that have been heavily debated within the developer community for years. And it doesn't seem like that's going to change anytime soon. Developers have a lot of opinions when it comes to what's best and what's not. In this video, I'm going to talk about which is the best operating system for web developers. Is it Windows? Is it macOS? Or is it Linux? And me personally, I've been using all three operating systems. I do use Windows, I do use macOS, and I do use Linux on a daily basis. So I'm very familiar with the pros and cons of each operating system, the pain points that do exist, the learning curve that can eat up a lot of your time when you're going from one operating system that you've been using for years and then trying to do the same thing with another operating system. Now, some operating systems are very easy to use out of the box and some are a little bit more difficult. But this is what I tell people. With simplicity of use comes a lot of limitations in how you can configure your setup. And if you're only focused on price and trying to spend as little as possible, then you're going to run into quality control issues or limitation in the longevity of that device. Now, if you want full control of your operating system, if you want to be able to configure it down to every single process that's being run, that adds a layer of complexity that initially might take up a lot of your time, but sometimes it's worth it. And then there's the fact that sometimes things just work easier on one operating system than they do on another operating system. And that's often the case because a developer might favor a particular OS and may not have the time to make something as compatible with an alternate operating system. Then there's the issue of software. Commercial software thrives in Windows and macOS, but isn't always made for a Linux distribution. For instance, Adobe. Adobe makes great products that works in Windows and macOS. But out of the box, it does not work with Linux. You're going to have to jump through a few hoops to get some of your Adobe products to work on a Linux platform. But before we go any further, I want to first mention the fact that the best computer you could use for web development is the one that you currently have. Whichever it is, make it work for you. And then when you start making money and you have the funds to invest in another computer, that's when you have to make a decision. Do you want to stay with the operating system you're currently working with, or do you want to change to another OS? And remember, your computer is one of many tools you're going to use in order to get your job done as a web developer. It's arguably the most important tool you have in your tool set. So utilizing an operating system that you're familiar with, that you're comfortable with, that you can get around efficiently and be productive with, that's important. You don't want to be fighting your operating system. But as a web developer, there are certain things you're going to have to do. So you can't always run away from configuration files and things of that nature. So to give you a sense of what I'm going to be talking about here, I want to show you some of the laptops that I'm going to be talking about. All right, so first off here, this is a very affordable Dell laptop. Got this for less than $500. It doesn't have the best specs. It doesn't have the best technology in it, but it gets the job done. And even with a very low powered computer like this, you can do web development on it. Then there's always the MacBook Pro. This is an older generation one. And I also have a MacBook Air as well that I work with. And they're very good devices. Now this one, this is a Pi top. This has a Raspberry Pi and is by far probably the most affordable solution because you can get started with a Raspberry Pi for about 35 bucks. If you want to get a whole kit, it could cost you about 120 at most. And then I have this laptop here, which I featured in another video. This is an older Lenovo laptop that I reconfigured to have Ubuntu as the operating system on it. So this is great as well. And this one, this big one here, this is the workhorse. This is my Alienware laptop. It's the most expensive of the bunch, but it's also the most powerful laptop of the bunch. Now, obviously, if you're going to get a fully spec'd out MacBook Pro, it's going to cost more. But in terms of what I currently have and use, this is the most powerful one. All right, so some quick facts, and most of this stuff you already know. But Windows has the lion's share of the consumer market when it comes to personal computers, whether it's laptops or desktops. macOS comes in second, and really a distant second when it comes into comparison with Windows. And trailing the pack is Linux for the consumer market. You're going to see that Linux pretty much has about 2% of the consumer market as a whole. But the reason why this debate continues and why this debate matters is because Linux is the main operating system used on the vast majority of websites. Linux is the king of the hill when it comes to the server-side technology used to power everything from your very local blog to your Fortune 500 corporate sites. So now let's talk about for you, for the web developer. Which is the best operating system? Which is the OS you should be using when you're programming your website locally? Because remember, there's 3 environments you got to focus on. There's your local development environment, there's your staging environment, then there's your production environment. So when you're developing locally, this is what this conversation is all about. So in order to really get hands-on with this, let's first discuss what does a web developer actually need. When you're coding, this is what you need. You need a laptop or a desktop. You need a browser like Chrome or Firefox, a text editor or IDE like VS Code or Atom or Sublime Text or PHP Storm or any of the others that exist out there. Since we're focusing on web development, you're going to need support for either PHP, for Python, maybe Node, NPM, probably support for Git for version control. You're going to need support for a database like MySQL or MariaDB and a local web server like Apache or Nginx. Now, most of the stuff you can get in a package, so that makes it very easy to get started. So that's what you need. Now let's talk about some factors you have to consider besides what you need. Price might be a factor. Like I said before, you can utilize something like a Raspberry Pi that with a full kit can cost you maybe 120 bucks. Or you can go as high up as a fully spec'd out MacBook Pro. That could cost you anywhere from $4,000 to $7,000. So pricing, that's a factor. Now, longevity should be a factor as well. And this is a tough one because the more money you spend on a laptop or a computer, generally the better the quality will be. The last thing you want is for your laptop or your computer to fail you. In that regards, Apple has been known for making high quality laptops and desktops for years. Their machines tend to last you more than 5 years, sometimes 10 years. I have laptops here that are from 2011, but I also have a Windows laptop from 2012 as well. Now that one I did reconfigure to host Ubuntu on it, but the actual equipment still works. But just because it'll work 5-10 years from now doesn't mean it's still the best option. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. Depends on your use case. But we know that technology is evolving on a nearly day-by-day basis. Processors are getting faster, GPUs are getting more powerful, memory is getting faster, RAM is faster, storage is faster. And because technology is improving so fast, and this generally goes with what's called Moore's Law, and that's a topic for another video, but because technology is moving so fast, software tries to take advantage of the latest tech. And sometimes older technology may not be able to keep up. So a general rule of thumb is you want a laptop or computer that will last you at least 5 years. You could keep it longer and you could definitely use it longer. And for web development, the type of software you're going to use is most likely not going to need the fastest GPU or likely not going to need the fastest CPU. But if you're running virtual machines, if you're running other technology on it, that's when that becomes more of an issue. And your hardware requirements come into play as well. That's another factor. If you're going to be focusing just really on HTML and CSS and JavaScript and the front end of a website, then you're not going to need such a powerful machine. But now if you're going to be running multiple virtual machines, if you're going to be doing a lot of data intense type work, then you're going to want something a little bit more powerful. You're going to want a little bit better graphics card, a more powerful CPU, definitely going to want more RAM because you're going to need that for your virtual machines. And you're going to need more hard drive space. Ideally, very fast and large SSDs. The beauty of Windows and Linux is you could build your own computers. Like I built my main workstation computer and it's what I use when I want to work with a lot of virtual machines. It has 64 gigabytes of RAM. It has over 4 terabytes of SSD space on it. It's running a very fast hexa-core processor, has liquid cooling. It gets the job done. It is a beast of a machine. But again, it has a very specific use case. running a lot of virtual machines. What's good about building your own computer is you could dual boot more than one operating system. Now you could do that with a laptop as well, and that's something you might want to look into, maybe having Windows and Linux both running natively on your laptop. Now this next part of the conversation is about productivity. As a web developer, do you want to just focus on code? Do you just want to type away at the keyboard and start creating your application or your program or your piece of software? Or do you want to be very involved in the way that software runs on your system? Do you want to fine-tune your OS so that way you'll get the maximum performance out of it? If you're running a website, then the answer to that is yes. You want to be able to configure it to max out your optimization potential. But that does take time. That might decrease your productivity unless you start getting to scripting, where you could use bash scripts and other types of scripts to automate the process for you. I definitely recommend that. And as I mentioned, software support is another factor. As a web developer, you might need to use some other types of software, and that will often work on Windows and macOS, but may not work on Linux. Now again, there's workarounds. You could use Wine, and Wine is another piece of software that you could use in order to use software like Adobe Photoshop or Illustrator on your Linux distribution. Doesn't work as well as using it natively on Windows or macOS, and you might be a few versions behind. But if you're desperate to use Adobe on Linux, that might be an option. A better option is to use something like GIMP instead of Photoshop, using something like Inkscape instead of Illustrator, and there's a wealth of other open source software that you could use in order to get the same type of features and functionality you would out of commercial software from Windows and macOS. And then there's the factor of, are you a freelancer or do you work for an agency or a company? If you're a freelancer, then you really have to make a decision. How much can you afford to spend on your technology? And which operating system do you prefer working with? If you work for a company or an agency, most often they're going to supply you with the technology you need. And you're probably going to have to use the technology stack that they use at the company. All right, so let's start talking about Windows for web development. Is it a good option? Should it even be considered? If you listen to some people, they say Windows, it's not made for web development. It's not made for that type of workflow. And I'm going to tell you that's not the case. I've been using Windows for years and I've been using it effectively. But like anything, you're going to have to load up additional software. You're going to have to configure things in order to work properly. And sometimes things might not work exactly the same. And that's why for years, developers said you need a Unix type system. But Windows, Microsoft in general, they are investing heavily in the open source community. They even have the Windows Subsystem for Linux that makes it possible for you to run a Linux distribution right there within your Windows operating system. So now this takes away one of the major advantages that macOS or Apple products have had for years. And the fact that Windows PCs, Windows powered PCs, come in at a lower price point, it's often the most affordable option if you're looking for something to get to work fast. And if you're a gamer, then Windows is the way to go. Because even though Apple is trying, Windows is still the preferred system for gamers. And since pricing is a factor, for a Windows PC or for a Windows laptop, you can pick one up for about $300, or you could spend thousands of dollars if you need something that's more powerful. But is Windows in general good for web development? Even if you're not using the Windows Subsystem for Linux, is it a viable option? And the answer is yes, it is. I mean, you're going to need to install software, right? You're going to need to do the same thing with macOS as well. So if you're working with HTML, CSS, JavaScript, if you need to work with PHP, Python, if you need MySQL, MariaDB, if you need to spin up a local web server like Apache, you could either install each individually or you can install a package, which is most often what people do. You can install XAMPP, you can install RAMP, you can install MAMP, you can install local by Flywheel, you could use Docker, you could use Variant, Vagrants, and there's a lot of other options out there for you to use. And that will give you the capability to work with PHP, with Python, with MySQL, and start working on your website. And for your favorite text editors, you're going to be able to use VS Code. It is a Microsoft product. You're going to be able to use Atom. That's also a Microsoft product. They purchased it. You could use Sublime Text, you could use PHP Storm, you could use NetBeans. There's a bunch of options out there. And besides running the Windows Subsystem for Linux, you could also choose to install something like VirtualBox or VMware Community Edition. distribution. Now, these technologies will give you the ability to run multiple operating systems at the same time in their own separate containers, meaning you could work with your Windows-powered PC, simultaneously working with Ubuntu Linux, simultaneously running with CentOS, and maybe booting up a Fedora box or a Kali Linux box. Virtualization technology makes it possible for you to work with multiple operating systems all on one host machine. Now that does change the argument even for those who believe down to their core that Windows is not the best option for web development. Now you might run into some issues with Node if you're running it natively on Windows. It's going to work for the most part. Most packages and modules are going to work, but you might sometimes run into issues. And if that's the case, then just boot up Windows Subsystem for Linux or use VirtualBox and spin up a local Linux distribution and you're good to go. What I do recommend is that no matter what operating system you use, make sure to check the documentation pages of that piece of software or the programming language you're going to be working with to see what the requirements are to get it to work properly. They'll often have a guide on how to do it with Windows, how to do it with macOS, and how to do it with Linux. Now, what about quality and longevity for Windows? We have to remember that Microsoft created Windows as an operating system that manufacturers can use within their computers. So we have a lot of different manufacturers. We have Dell, we have Asus, we have Acer, we have Razer, we have HP, we have Lenovo, and there's a whole bunch of different manufacturers. So quality control is in the manufacturer's hands. And also the amount of money you spend will determine the quality of materials used. One thing I do like on a Windows laptop is the fact that you can get a touchscreen. Now, it might not be the most beneficial for web development, but it does help out when you're navigating websites, when you're scrolling. You can see how the experience is. And besides the touchscreen, I think that you really have to focus on how good is the touchpad. The touchpad matters because if you're going to be fighting with your computer or your laptop, if it's not going to register the inputs that you're putting in it properly, that could be a pain point that might make your development process more of a headache. So you want to make sure that the laptop that you get has a good touchpad. This is where macOS shines. This is where Apple laptops shine. Apple is known for making some of the best touchpads in the entire industry. And for a while, Windows really wasn't that good. But over time, they started getting better. And some of the manufacturers are using better materials like premium glass for the touchpad. And you want to make sure that the laptop supports Windows precision points for the touchpad drivers and software. That'll make sure that it responds to your input and the different gestures that you put into the touchpad. All right, so now what about Apple? What about macOS? Is macOS the preferred device for web development? Is it something that you should spend your extra money in order to get? Now, pricing is very relative to where you are financially. And I don't want to say that everything depends on the amount of money you throw down, because you can get a high quality laptop that's Windows powered or Linux powered that gets the job done, just as well as a macOS operating system. But for years, macOS and Apple have had a closer relationship in essence with developers because of the Unix nature of the operating system itself. Unix-based operating systems are very similar to Linux. Linux is actually a fork of Unix itself, and so is macOS. So they share a lot of very similar features. The terminal is very similar. The commands that you're going to input into a macOS terminal is going to be very similar to what you input into a Linux-powered laptop. Now, there are some differences within the shell environment and some of the commands, but they're not really going to be to the point that you feel lost. Now, when you survey a lot of developers who do use Mac, they're going to say that they like the minimalist type design of the operating system itself. It doesn't feel like it gets in your way. It's easy to use, it's fluid, it's smooth. The build quality of the device is often better than what you're going to find within the Windows market. And if you're really interested in being part of the Apple ecosystem with the iPhone, the iPad, maybe an Apple Watch and a MacBook Pro or something like that, then you're going to want to make sure you have the MacBook Pro or a MacBook Air. That way you can easily integrate with all your other devices. Now, that being said, you can get your Windows powered PC or laptop to integrate with your other Apple devices as well. you could use third-party software like, let's say, OneDrive, or you could use Word, or you could use PowerPoint. You could use that on your Windows laptop and then on your iPad. What about text messages, SMS? One of the best things about Apple is that you can start up a text on your iPhone and then continue that conversation on your MacBook Pro or MacBook Air. But now there's also software that enables you to connect your Windows laptop to your iPhone, and you could start a conversation on your laptop that'll still be on your iPhone, or you can make connecting the two devices seamless. Now, it may not be as seamless as working in the native Apple ecosystem, but it works as an alternative. Now, the price of an Apple laptop, of a MacBook Pro, is significantly higher than that of a Windows-powered laptop, and definitely more expensive than a Linux-powered laptop. But with that price point comes better quality, comes longevity, and typically a better warranty. Apple is known for resolving issues like replacements of logic boards even years after. I'm talking like 5 years after the purchase of a product. If the logic board or if something happens to it, their support tends to be second to none. And of course, it has support for the major browsers you're going to be working with. It has support for the major text editors and IDEs you're probably going to be using. You could use all the server software you probably need for it, like you could use MAMP, you could use XAMPP, you could install each individual package yourself if you want. You can, without a problem, use Node, use NPM, you can use Git, you can use pretty much everything you're going to need in order to get the job done. And sometimes it's going to work just a little bit better. And again, the terminal is so similar to Linux that when you do have to start managing servers and you have to SSH into that server, you're going to feel right at home. And that's an important thing to remember. So that being said, let's start talking about Linux. What about using Linux as your main operating system for web development? Is that an option? Now, I know in the beginning I said that Windows has the lion's share of the consumer market when it comes to laptops and desktops. Second is obviously Apple with the MacBook Pro and MacBook Air. And Linux just has a very small fraction of the market. But you can find distributors or manufacturers that are going to sell you a Linux-powered PC or a Linux-powered laptop. And considering the fact that the overwhelming majority of websites are using a Linux operating system, and the best way to interact with that operating system is via the command line, it may not be a bad decision to choose a Linux distribution as your main OS. But again, like I said before, people don't set out initially to purchase a Linux-powered PC or a Linux-powered laptop. And while they're out there, they're not that easy to find. You're not going to walk into your local Best Buy or your local computer store and find a Linux-powered laptop. But we live in a digital age. You can just go online and you can check out companies like System 76. Their whole entire business is on selling Linux-powered laptops and desktops. And like I said, you could always take your older laptop and re-image it to use an Ubuntu system or another operating system as the main OS. And now the benefits of using Linux besides the terminal is the fact that you're going to feel right at home when you're managing your servers. And since it's very important for you to have a mirror image of your production environment in your local environment, so that way you can identify any issues that might present itself before it becomes critical, using Linux natively is one of the best ways to do that. And you're definitely going to find that most of the software in terms of web development anyways is going to work better. You're going to have it easier when you're working with Node and NPM. And you're going to have it easier if you want to use different versions of PHP or Python in your environment. With Linux does come a lot more configuration. There is a lot more hands-on in terms of the management of the operating system itself. But that's valuable experience that you're going to gain that's going to help you in the long term. So let's quickly look at some price points of similar powered laptops. Let's look at the Dell XPS. Let's look at the Apple MacBook Pro, and let's look at a Linux option. Now for this 15-inch Dell XPS laptop, this is going to run you about $3,500. This one has the 10th generation Intel Core i9 processor. It has a GeForce GTX 1650 Ti graphics card and 64 gigabytes of DDR4 RAM with 2 terabytes of NVMe solid state drive. So about $3,500 for the Dell XPS. Now, if we look at the MacBook Pro, now mind you, the MacBook Pro does need to get updated. It's probably slated to get updated in the next couple of months. But for a similar powered laptop, you're going to be looking at about $4,900. So far we're talking about a difference of $3,500 to $4,900. That's a $1,400 difference right there alone. But now let's look at Linux. If we want to get a nicely powered Linux computer, let's make the specs the same. Try to keep everything as close to being equal as possible. We're going to be looking at $3,718. So this is interesting. In this case, to get something that's similar, and again, it's not exactly the same, right? There's going to be differences. But to get something similar in tech specs, we're going to see that the Dell XPS is actually the more affordable option, even while being nicely spec'd out, versus the MacBook Pro, which is obviously the most expensive of the three, and even more affordable than the Linux system fully spec'd out. Now, that being said, obviously if you choose a lower end configuration, if you don't need the 3080 graphics card, then you can lower that price significantly. And the same can be said for Dell as well. Now, one thing to remember, if you're the type of person that likes to use a lot of different peripherals, like I like to use different keyboards or secondary keyboards and different types of trackballs. Some of those are made specifically for Windows and might not work well with macOS or might not work well with a Linux distribution. The driver support might not be there. You might be able to get around it by writing your own drivers and get some of the functionality you need, but it's not going to be something that is a smooth transition. If you like using macro keys are awesome. They're like keyboard shortcuts, but to the next level. Then your best option would be a Windows laptop or PC. So man, that's a lot of stuff that we just covered. And the question is not really answered because there really is no perfect operating system for web development. It really comes down to your personal preference. It comes down to your capability of purchasing, meaning the price point. Is it something you can afford? And even if you can afford it, do you need something that's fully spec'd out? Or can you do the work with something that's a little bit more affordable, lower powered, but gets the job done? And yes, back in the day, it was more of a pain point to get Windows to play nice with the different types of development tools that we developers like to use. But since Microsoft has been really focused on the open source community, they purchased GitHub, they are heavily invested in VS Code, they purchased Atom, they made it possible to use Linux in Windows with the Windows Subsystem for Linux. And of course, you could always use VirtualBox. Then the lines between Windows, macOS, and Linux, those are really blurred now. So I know we covered a lot. I know I mentioned a lot. But the gist of it is the best computer and the best laptop for you to use is the one that you currently have. And then determine if you need to level up when you have the money to do so. My number one recommendation, spend a little bit of time if you can with each operating system. See which one feels better for you and then choose one. Unless you're like me and you need a computer science lab that integrates all operating systems. But you're most likely going to go all in on one operating system, go deep into that operating system, figure out how it works, master it, and that will increase your productivity level. So I guess the answer is that the best operating system is the one that you feel right at home with. Alright, if you like this video, give it a thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe, smash that notification icon. If you have any thoughts, comments, or suggestions, leave them down below. And as always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Happy coding!